The moment my heels touched the marble floor of the Whitmore Grand, my husband's hand found the small of my back. Not possessive, just steady, like he could feel the way my breath had gone shallow the second we walked through those doors. "You okay?" he murmured against my ear. "Ask me in an hour," I said. He almost smiled. Almost. The ballroom had been transformed into something out of a magazine. Ivory draping from every chandelier, white roses in crystal vases so tall you could barely see the person sitting across from you. My mother's taste, obviously. She'd always believed that beauty was something you displayed, not something you felt. Table set for 200. String quartet near the back. Open bar with a line already forming even though it was barely 6 o'clock. I hadn't been inside this building in 9 years. I hadn't seen my brother in 9 years, and standing near the entrance to the main hall accepting congratulations with the practiced ease of someone who'd spent a lifetime performing happiness was my father. He looked older, smaller somehow. The expensive suit couldn't quite disguise it. He didn't see me, not yet. My daughter tugged at my hand. She's 7, and she has her father's eyes in my stubbornness, a combination that still surprises me daily. "Mom, which one's Uncle Kevin?" "He's probably in the back with the groomsmen," I said. "We'll find him later." She seemed satisfied with that and turned her attention to the dessert table across the room. My husband caught my eye over her head and gave me a look that said, "We can still leave." I shook my head slightly. We couldn't. We both knew that. I hadn't driven 4 hours to leave before the cocktail hour. I took a glass of sparkling water from a passing tray and reminded myself to breathe. "My name is Adeline. I'm 33 years old. I live in Portland now, in a house with a garden I actually tend myself, with a husband who reads to our daughter every night even when he's exhausted, and a company I built from nothing while everyone who was supposed to love me unconditionally was busy telling anyone who would listen that I was a cautionary tale." My brother's wedding invitation had arrived on a Tuesday. I'd stared at it for a long time before opening it. Kevin and I had been close once, inseparable, the way some siblings are when they're surviving the same household together. But he'd been 20 when everything fell apart, and 20 is old enough to make a choice, and he'd made his. He stayed. He kept quiet. He let our parents rewrite history, and he'd been living inside that revised story for 9 years while I built a new life outside it. The invitation was handwritten. Inside, in his actual handwriting, not printed. I know I have no right to ask. "But I want you there. Kay." It took me 3 weeks to respond. Another 2 to actually buy the plane tickets, another week to cancel them and then buy them again. My husband never told me what to do. He just said, "Whatever you decide, I'm with you." So here we were. The cocktail hour moved the way these things do, slow circles, the same questions repeated at every cluster of guests. My daughter found the chocolate fountain and considered it the greatest discovery of her life. My husband fell into easy conversation with a couple we'd been seated near, something about a hiking trail in Colorado. I drifted, holding my water glass, not quite looking for anyone, but not quite avoiding anyone either. "Excuse me." A woman about my age, warm smile, a corsage on her wrist that marked her as part of the wedding party. "Are you a friend of Kevin's or Simone's side?" "Kevin's," I said. "Old family." "Oh, wonderful. I'm his cousin on his mother's." She stopped. Recalibrated. "Wait. Are you Adeline?" Something moved through my chest. Not quite dread. Not quite relief. "I am." Her face did something complicated. "I'm his cousin Margot. We met once when we were kids. I don't know if you remember." I didn't, but I nodded anyway. "He'll be so glad you came," she said quietly. Something in her tone suggested she knew more than she was pretending not to. "He talks about you sometimes, not to everyone, but sometimes." I didn't know what to do with that, so I smiled and excused myself. The thing about walking into a room full of people who know a version of you that doesn't exist is that you start doing math in your head, almost involuntarily. Who here has heard the story? Who thinks I dropped out of college, drifted, made bad choices, ended up somewhere embarrassing? Who's looking at me right now and feeling sorry for Kevin that his unstable sister showed up to ruin the mood? My parents had been telling that story for 9 years. The short version is this. I was 24. I had just been accepted into a competitive graduate architecture program. And I'd also just discovered that the money my grandmother had left specifically for my education had been quietly redirected into my brother's real estate investment, a venture my father believed in and my grandmother most certainly would not have approved of. When I confronted my parents about it, my mother told me I was being selfish. My father told me I was dramatic and unstable. And when I said I was going to speak with their estate attorney, my mother told our extended family that I had suffered a breakdown, that I was making accusations because I was unwell, that they were very worried about me. But there was only so much a family could do. I hadn't suffered a breakdown. I was furious. There's a difference, but I was also 24 and didn't have proof yet, and by the time I did it was 2 years later and I'd moved across the country and started over. I'd enrolled in a different program, smaller, less prestigious, fully funded by my own work and 2 scholarships I applied for myself. I graduated, I got licensed. I started a small practice with a colleague I trusted. We grew. 4 years later, Aldwell Studio had a reputation substantial enough that I stopped having to explain it to anyone. My parents still told people I'd had a breakdown. I knew this because my grandmother's sister, my great-aunt Claudette, still called me on my birthday and occasionally said things like, "Your mother mentioned you've been having a hard time," in a careful voice that told me she didn't entirely believe it. I never corrected the story with Claudette. I wasn't sure why. Maybe because correcting it would require telling the whole thing, and the whole thing is exhausting. Maybe because I'd learned that the people who loved my parents' version of me couldn't be argued out of it, and the people who loved me didn't need to be convinced. My husband found me near the window that overlooked the courtyard garden. "Your parents are at the table by the stairs," he said quietly. "I know. Your father looked this direction twice." "Did he recognize me?" "I don't think so yet. 9 years changes people. I'd gotten older. I cut my hair differently. I walk differently. More settled, I think. Though that might just be vanity. And I hadn't exactly announced my attendance to anyone in the family except Kevin, who'd kept it to himself. The thing I hadn't anticipated was how strange it would feel to be invisible inside a room I technically belonged in. Strange, but also, if I'm being honest with myself, a little useful. The dinner seating had us 4 tables away from my parents, close enough that I could see my mother's pearls catch the light when she turned, far enough that I could eat without having to perform anything. My daughter charmed the elderly couple to her left within approximately 90 seconds and spent most of the first course asking them about their dog. My husband quietly moved his chair slightly between me and the direction of my parents' table. He didn't make a thing of it, he just did it. Kevin found me before the main course arrived. I saw him coming from across the room, still the same loose-limbed walk he'd had since he was a teenager, though he was wearing a suit better than he used to. He stopped a few feet away, like he wasn't sure of his welcome, and for a moment we just looked at each other. "You came," he said. "I came." He sat down in the empty chair beside me that belonged to someone currently at the bar, and he put his forearms on the table and looked at his hands. "I didn't know if you would." "I wouldn't have blamed you, I wouldn't have blamed you. I know, I should have," he stopped. "I should have done a lot of things differently." "Kevin." He looked up. "We can talk about all of it. But not tonight. Tonight you're getting married." Something moved across his face. Relief and guilt in equal measure, which was probably the most honest expression I'd seen from anyone in this family in a very long time. He nodded, and then his eyes moved to my daughter, who had just successfully convinced the elderly man beside her to show her pictures of his dog on his phone. That's your niece?" I said. "Her name is June." He watched her for a moment, and I watched him watching her. "She's great," he said, and his voice had gone rough. "She really is." He cleared his throat. "Mom and Dad don't know you're here yet. I figured. I didn't tell them. I wasn't sure you'd actually come, and I didn't want—" He shook his head. "It doesn't matter. You're here." He went back to his new wife when the entrees arrived. Simone was tall and direct-eyed, and had shaken my hand earlier with the grip of someone who'd been briefed on complicated family situations and decided to simply treat me like a normal person. I liked her immediately. I hoped she'd be good for him. I hoped he'd deserve her. It was during the main course that it happened. There's a man at these events. There's always a man who moves through the room like he's networking. Not in an unpleasant way, exactly. Just purposeful. At my brother's wedding, it was a colleague of the groom's, apparently, named Patrick. I'd seen him stop at 3 different tables before he reached ours. He introduced himself to the group. We went around the table with names and connections, and when I said my name and mentioned I was Kevin's sister, he blinked. Adeline. Wait, Adeline Marsh? I hadn't been Adeline Marsh in 3 years. I'm Adeline Vasquez now, after my husband, which is the name Aldwell Studio operates under half the time because we'd rebranded when we merged, but I'd been Adeline Marsh when we'd won a contract. Patrick's firm had also competed for, 2 years ago, a community arts center in Seattle that had gotten written up in a few industry publications. Formerly, I said, Aldwell Studio. His expression shifted in the specific way that happens when a name you've heard in professional contexts suddenly appears in a personal one. Aldwell did the Halcyon Center. We did. That project was extraordinary. We followed it pretty closely. The passive solar integration was, he seemed to remember he was at a dinner table. Sorry, occupational hazard. My husband, bless him, just picked up his fork and continued eating. Patrick was enthusiastic and clearly genuine, and I answered his questions and tried not to monitor what was happening 2 tables over, but it was impossible not to notice when my mother turned in her chair. She was looking in this direction because Patrick had a carrying voice, one of those voices that fills a room without quite shouting. And she'd heard enough, my name, or Aldwell, or some fragment, to make her pay attention. I watched her clock Patrick. Then, the table. Then, finally, me. I've thought about this moment a lot in the years since. What it would feel like. Whether I'd feel triumph, or grief, or some complicated mixture of things I didn't have a name for. What I actually felt in that specific second was very still, like the moment before a photograph gets taken, when the light is exactly right and you're not quite holding your breath. She recognized me. I could tell from the way she went motionless in her own chair, the poor earring-catching light as her head stopped moving. My father was in conversation with someone across the table. He didn't notice. I held my mother's gaze for exactly 3 seconds. Then I looked back at Patrick and answered his question about load-bearing considerations and adaptive reuse projects as though nothing had happened. The rest of the dinner passed. Patrick moved on. My daughter finished her meal and asked if she could go look at the flower arrangements. My husband went with her. I sat in the comfortable quiet of an empty moment and waited. My mother arrived at my side between the entree and the cake. She looked the way she always looked. Composed, appropriate, every hair in place. She also looked like she'd walked into a room she hadn't expected and hadn't quite recalibrated yet. Adeline. Her voice was controlled. I didn't know you were coming. Kevin invited me. He didn't mention. She stopped herself. You look well. Thank you. She sat in the empty chair beside me, June's chair, temporarily, and smoothed her dress, and I understood that she was buying herself a moment to think. My mother is not a stupid woman. She has never been stupid. She is calculating and presentable, and she understands audiences, which is why she'd managed to maintain the narrative about me for 9 years in a community of people who trusted her. That man you were speaking with, she said. Patrick Elmore. He's in architecture. He is? He seemed to know your work. He does. A pause. She was approaching something sideways the way she always had. Your father and I had no idea you'd. She smoothed her dress again. We heard you've been in Portland. I have been. For 6 years. And your work. It seems to be going well. I looked at her. It is. Something shifted in her expression. Not quite regret. Not quite relief. Something caught between what she believed or told herself she believed and what was sitting in front of her right now, with a husband 2 tables away and a 7-year-old examining floral centerpieces and a professional reputation solid enough that strangers at her son's wedding stopped conversations to mention it. The things that were said, she started. After you left, you have to understand the position we were in, Mom. I kept my voice quiet. We don't have to do this tonight. She seemed almost relieved by that. No, of course not. This is Kevin's night. Yes. She pressed her lips together. Yes, it is. She stood up, smoothed her dress one more time, and then paused. "Your daughter," she said. "June. June Eleanor. Eleanor was your grandmother's middle name." "I know," I said. She looked at me for a moment longer and then walked back to her table. My father, I noticed, watched her return with an expression that told me she'd say something to him in the car, later, and whatever she said would be the version she'd decided on. It might be close to the truth. It might not. I had stopped expecting particular things from them years ago. What I hadn't expected, what I genuinely hadn't prepared for, was my father making his way to me just before the cake was cut. He is a taller man than his personality, if that makes sense. He fills a door frame in a way that probably read as authoritative when I was a child. Now, he mostly just reads as older. He stood beside my chair and didn't sit down. "Adeline, Dad." He didn't say anything for a moment. I let the silence be his to fill. "Kevin should have told us," he said finally. "Maybe," I said, "or maybe he knew what would happen if he did." He shifted his weight. My father had never in my memory admitted to being wrong. I did not expect this evening to be the exception. What he said instead was, "I'd like to meet him. Your husband." That surprised me in spite of everything. "He's with June, near the dessert table." He nodded once. Then, "June, that's a good name." "We thought so." He walked toward the dessert table. I watched him stop a few feet from where my husband stood with our daughter, the two of them examining a tower of petit fours with the seriousness the situation apparently demanded. My father said something. My husband said something back. June looked up, decided this new person warranted evaluation, and then apparently determined he passed some internal 7-year-old standard because she held out a piece of chocolate in offering. He took it. I looked away. Out at the room, at the white roses and the string quartet moving into something slower, at my brother dancing with his new wife in the center of the floor, both of them laughing at something, relaxed in a way I'd rarely seen Kevin when we were growing up. Cousin Margot peered at my shoulder. "You doing okay over here?" "I think so," I said. "Kevin was nervous you wouldn't come. He's been nervous about it for months." "I know." She was quiet for a moment. "He never actually believed what they said. About the breakdown. He told me that once, a few years ago, he said she didn't have a breakdown, she had a point, and I was too afraid to back her up." She paused. "He felt terrible about it. Still does." I watched my brother spin his wife around the dance floor. "He made a choice," I said, "and then he lived in it for a while, and then he reached out. That's more than a lot of people do. Are you going to be okay? With your parents?" "Tonight I'm going to eat cake and watch my daughter terrorize the dance floor," I said. "The rest we can figure out over time." She laughed, which I appreciated. June did in fact terrorize the dance floor. She has zero self-consciousness about dancing, a quality I envy unreservedly, and she pulled her father out there by the wrist and refused to let him leave for 3 songs. At some point Kevin joined them, doing an impression of a bad wedding DJ that made June absolutely lose it. And I sat at the edge of the room and felt something I hadn't quite felt in years, some version of ordinary. The ordinary of watching people you love be ridiculous together in public. The ordinary of belonging somewhere, even a somewhere that was still partly broken and partly being repaired. My mother did not speak to me again that evening. My father came back to return June's chocolate piece, which she'd apparently been holding this whole time without eating, and held it out to her when she came off the dance floor, and she thanked him with the automatic politeness we'd been practicing. And then she turned and asked me in a stage whisper, "Who is that man?" "That's my father," I said. "Your grandfather." She looked back at him with the frank assessment of a child. "Does he like chocolate?" "I think he forgot to eat his." She considered this. "That's sad," she said with complete sincerity, and then ran back out to where her father was waiting for the next song. My father stood with his piece of petit four and watched her go. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. 3 weeks after the wedding, I received a letter in the mail, Kevin's handwriting on the envelope. Inside were 2 pages. An actual letter, handwritten, the kind nobody sends anymore. He wrote about the 9 years. He didn't excuse himself. He didn't blame anyone else. He said, I knew what they did was wrong, and I told myself I couldn't afford to rock the boat, and that was a lie I told myself because I was scared, not because it was true. He wrote about watching me from across the room that night, watching the way people spoke to me, the way I moved through the space, the way June laughed. He wrote, "You built a whole life and I missed all of it, and that's on me." He asked if we could start again. Not erase what happened, just start again. I sat with that letter for a few days before I responded, and then I wrote back. I didn't offer him absolution immediately. That wouldn't have been honest. What I said was that I was willing to try, and that trying would look like small things first. A phone call, dinner when I was next in the city, June meeting her uncle properly. I said the trust would have to be rebuilt slowly and that I wasn't going to pretend 9 years of silence had cost nothing, because it had. But I also said I was glad he'd reached out. I was glad I'd come. I meant both things equally. The Halcyon Center in Seattle opened its community wing to the public last fall. There's a program there now, a design mentorship for first-generation college students, funded partially through a grant I'd applied for quietly and partially through a private donation I'd made without putting my name on it. The program director emailed me to say the first cohort had 8 students and one of them had already been accepted to a graduate program. I read that email at the kitchen table while June was doing homework, and my husband was making something that smelled like garlic and herbs, and I thought about the money my grandmother had left for my education, what it was supposed to do, what it had done instead, and what happens when you take the thing that was supposed to hold you back and build something with it anyway. My grandmother's middle name was Eleanor. June doesn't know that yet. Someday I'll tell her. I used to think the hardest part was leaving, packing up what I had, moving across the country, starting completely over with no safety net and no one in my corner except myself. But I was wrong. The hardest part was the years in between. The years of building something real while knowing that back home people who shared my last name were telling a different story about me entirely. A story where I was fragile, where I'd fallen apart, where my absence was proof of something broken rather than something chosen. What my parents never understood, what I think they still may not fully understand, is that actions accumulate. Every choice you make deposits something into the world, and eventually the account comes due. They chose to redirect money that wasn't theirs to touch. They chose to protect that decision with a story that cost me my reputation among the people I'd grown up with. And they chose, every year after, to keep living inside that story, rather than correct it. Each of those choices was small enough to feel manageable in the moment, I imagine, but they compounded. They always do. What I chose, in response, was to build. Not perfectly, not without fear or exhaustion or moments where I sat in my apartment at 26 and genuinely wasn't sure I was going to make it, but I kept going, not because I was trying to prove something to them, though I'd be lying if I said the thought never crossed my mind, but because the work itself mattered. The buildings mattered. The students in that mentorship program matter. You can start something for complicated reasons and still have it become something genuinely good. That's allowed. Kevin's letter, the one that arrived 3 weeks after the wedding, was 2 pages of someone finally putting down a weight they'd been carrying for 9 years. He didn't make excuses. He said he'd been scared and that he'd dressed that fear up as practicality and that he knew the difference now. That kind of honesty takes something. It doesn't erase 9 years, but it's not nothing either. I wrote back because I believe people can change direction. Not easily, not all at once, but genuinely. Moral intelligence isn't something you're born with in full. It's something you develop through choices, including the choices you get wrong first. June doesn't know the whole story yet. She's 7, and she held out a piece of chocolate to a grandfather she'd never met and didn't overthink it, because she hasn't learned yet to overthink those things. I want to protect that in her for as long as I can, but someday I'll tell her the version that's honest. Not to teach her to hold grudges, but to teach her that integrity is something you maintain even when it costs you. That resilience isn't about never getting knocked down, but about what you do with the time you're on the ground, and that the people who underestimate you are doing you information, not damage. The scholarship program is running its 2nd cohort now. I didn't put my name on it. I didn't need to.